Bial Sahab of the Monterey Institute and Syrian-born technology author Rahaf Arfoush. Thank you. Welcome back. Just before the break, we were mentioning, and I'm going to put the question to you, Bial Sahab, this war of words escalating between Moscow and Washington, reminiscent of the Cold War over who's doing what inside Syria, comes just ahead of next week's sit-down in Mexico between Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin. It's going to be a closed-door meeting. What's your prediction on what happens there?
Well, it's going to be quite an interesting meeting. I mean, I've been calling since November of last year that one of the better ways out of this crisis that we're facing in Syria is a very frank and transparent dialogue between the American president and the Russian president. I mean, so far, I think there's still a lot of mistrust, a lot of work to be done between the two presidents. I think President Barack Obama has developed a good working relationship with the Russian Prime Minister, Medvedev, but not necessarily with Putin. There's going to be a lot of give and take, and I hope that the meeting will be successful because in my mind I still believe that one of the better ways out of the crisis is a frank dialogue between the Russians and the Americans. And this is not just a dialogue over Syria. Like I said before, it's a dialogue over a range of issues in the Middle East, Russian interest in the Middle East, American interest in the Middle East, and missile defense in Europe, NATO strategy expansion. It's going to be quite a comprehensive dialogue.
And as you say, the personal chemistry may matter. Obama and Putin with very different personalities. Can anything constructive come out of that meeting?
Well, I mean, the personality issue is definitely relevant, but it's also the different domestic realities, political domestic realities in which both presidents operate. Putin might not necessarily like the American president, but more important than that, he is presiding over a constituency that might have a preference of, Russian policy that defies American designs and interests in the Middle East. So he has to answer those, what I would call domestic pressures. And this pretty much defines, in many ways, the Russian role in the Middle East and in the world itself. Basically, coming up with a new status in the world, post-Cold War, and in many ways defying, American ambitions and American designs in the Middle East and in the world at large.
Anton Kozlov, Vladimir Putin, how much does he care about Syria?
Well, I don't think.
Earlier this week, we had a debate about the domestic strife he has at home, and you heard Bial Sahab say they both have domestic concerns. How important is it for him to keep with the same policy of continuing to arm the regime in Damascus?
Well, I don't think it is the question of continuing to arm the regime of Damascus, but I think it is the question of continuing to project Russian power and interest to those regions where, for the past, we can say, 60 years, 50 years, Russia had a pretty important presence. And in fact, if you look at the continuity of Russian foreign policy, it's been always a very reactive foreign policy to all those American attempts to, Cold War attempts to encircle Russia, to contain Russia within a certain perimeter. Russians would always find a way out using a mix of economic assistance, ideological rhetorics, and so on and so forth to find friends. And in fact, Syria today is perhaps the last country in the Middle East which is still remains this kind of old ally. We no longer have Russia no longer has any allies that it used to have.
But can its friendship with Syria be something that's put on the bargaining table for other things?
Well, I don't think so, because we've seen with Gaddafi, Russians went along with the United Security Council resolution, and the regime was dismantled, and Russians didn't really get anything, lost a lot of money, were kind of bullied out. So Russians do not, I mean, Putin does not trust, and he openly stated that he does not trust the United States for a number of reasons, NATO expansion, missile defense system, and there are many reasons why the United States or American allies, they would say one thing and then do something else. So, I mean, in that sense, I think he's got his point as someone who really very much interested in Russian foreign policy and who has a pretty, I would say, traditionalist, conservative foreign policy position.
So, Bilal Saab, you listen to Anton Kozlov there is no wiggle room after what happened in Libya.
Well, there's no question that the Russians and the Chinese were burned by the Libyan experience, and they certainly have every interest in not having that happen again. But I respectfully disagree with your speaker. I think there's always room for compromise between the two sides. It's just that they need to sit down together and hammer out those differences. There's much that Russia there's a lot, basically, that the Russians can do to preserve those interests that they have in Syria. It's just that they need to work with the Syrian people and not necessarily the Syrian government. I think Assad is expendable, and Russia has been pretty vocal about that. It's just that they need to make sure that those strategic interests that they have in Syria will be preserved in a post-Assad Syria.
All right, and on the France 24 Debate Facebook page, Tapiwa says, it is also important to take into account that both France and Britain, during the Gaddafi war, also supplied the rebels with ammunition. Isn't that a violation of the International Treaty of Arms Embargoes? Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this the maintenance of a double standard? When you put that question out there, is there a double standard?
Yeah, really. The state in the world, this is usual for them to apply the double standard. When you watch the Syria, France, Iran, Egypt, Slovakia, China, Russia has exported and continue to export for Russia to Syria. And in the European Union, France is obliged to respect a common position and the control of exportation. And this common position said you cannot export if there exists a risk of human rights violation. So why France exports to Syria? Why in the Eurosatory exhibition we have reasonable export which is present, and with no dialogue between France and reasonable export.
Rav Harfouch, that report we saw in part one, you saw one of the top Russian government official there welcome to the. Did it surprise you that France and Russia are at loggerheads over Syria, and yet the Russians have the welcome mat open to them at that arms expo?
No, I mean, maybe I'm a bit cynical, but I don't think, I think very few people in the parties that are talking about Syria actually care about Syria. I think it's, whether it's posturing after Libya or a bargaining chip potentially for later discussions or a play against Iran or whatever it is that it happens to be. I think, unfortunately, much to the the tragicness of it all is that nobody is really, really considering what's happening to the Syrian people, who, by the way, are being harmed quite immensely, even from an economic perspective. I mean, the regime is hurting from the embargo, but the people are hurting more. And so you are isolating the people. You are isolating them economically. Embassies have closed. I just feel like everyone is using Syria to make a statement, including different parts of the opposition as well. And nobody is thinking ahead as to what is going to happen in the next 2 years, 5 years, if recovery is even an option at this point.
All right, there are two other countries that are feeling the pinch directly. One is Lebanon. The other is Turkey, where we've seen a big spike in the number of refugees arriving. And it's not all Washington v. Moscow in this story. We've mentioned the Gulf states, Turkey in the front lines. Here's what the NATO Secretary General told France 24's Annette Young in an interview earlier this week.
Stress once again that we have no intention to intervene in Syria. However, of course, we monitor, we follow the situation closely because one of our allies, Syria, is a neighbor. Turkey is a neighbor of Syria, and Turkey may be impacted by what is going on in Syria.
Bilal Saab, is that sort of a nudge, a little wink to the authorities in Ankara to sort of give them the green light to go ahead and do something?
Perhaps, but I still believe that the Turks and NATO, writ large, is waiting for a firm decision by Washington in terms of what it is going to do in Syria. I do not think that the use of force in Syria or any military option will be entertained without active involvement by the United States.
And when the Gulf states supply weapons to some of the insurgents inside Syria, is that with the approval, the stamp of approval of Washington?
I would assume so. There's some sort of a division of labor here that's taking place. The Turks are providing training to the rebels and safe haven along the borders. The Americans are providing command and control and communications. And the Gulf states are providing weapons and money. So there seems to be quite a coherent formula here to try to assist as much as possible the rebels. But we all see that so far has produced limited results. I think that the rebels are gaining, they're becoming more effective, and they are sort of becoming more, bold in their offensive tactics against the regime. But the balance of power still really tilts heavily in favor of the government forces.
Another new twist inside of Syria is the presence, with the approval of Moscow, of UN military observers, and they've even started sending images through to the agencies there of their missions. Sometimes they've even been harassed. What does their presence bring? You were mentioning, Anton Kozlov, the need for negotiations. Those military observers being on the ground, does that help to calm the situation in any way?
Well, not that I know of. I mean, from what I could hear, violence still is flourishing there. I think it is important to have those elements. Now, whether they're going to be efficient, we had the Arab League observers back in February there, in January, February, and it wasn't very efficient. And if you read the report, it's quite interesting, the previous report of what was taking place there. So, I mean, of course, I think any international presence which may somehow prevent the continuation of violence, I think is positive. But I mean, I don't think any military intervention that a number of states were talking about would be a solution. I think it should be, as I said, some kind of international discussion involving all parties, including Russia, including Iran, including Syria, including all those who may have something to say in this situation.
On Wednesday, the French foreign minister had a press conference, and he talked about making Kofi Annan's peace plan binding, and with it evoked Chapter 7. Explain to us again, what does that mean, evoking Chapter 7?
Well, we're talking about the United Nations Charter. Basically, the violation of the United Nations Charter, it is considered as a violation of international law. So you may use force. Now, whether that is going to happen, you nevertheless need to have the approval
Of the Security Council.
Yes. So unless that takes place, now it is another way of trying to find, a number of resolutions were vetoed by Russia. So that may be one way of trying to find a solution. And who knows? It may not be necessarily the worst way of trying to find a solution. But I mean, I really don't know what would be the mechanism of doing that. I mean, it remains very murky,
Bilal Saab, is there anything in the works in New York that could bring the Russians on board?
Not that I've heard of anything, to be honest, but just to comment very quickly on your speaker's assertion is, saying that the French are probably going to mention Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter is more akin to the Palestinians going to the UN and trying to impose basically a solution on the Israelis about a two-state solution. Without political negotiations with the Russians and the Chinese, who continue to veto any Security Council resolutions, I think the the French proposal is really not going very far.
That same press conference, Laurent Fabius, the foreign minister, said Paris would suggest making other proposals, including ones that would tighten the screws, he says, on Damascus.
I'm going to immediately contact my European colleagues, Mrs. Ashton and my American colleagues, and suggest that we adopt, as early as our next foreign ministers' meeting, a new set of even tougher sanctions.
Raf Harfouch, you were saying how sanctions have hit the people harder than the regime. But is it better to push for tighter sanctions or to push for more weapons?
I mean, it's a very complicated issue. Ultimately, I think from a sanctions perspective, the more isolated the country feels, both from a regime perspective and from the opposition, from a civilian perspective, the more you're going to have desperate people. And the situation is not going to be the best suited for any type of the calm negotiations that I think people have been suggesting during this broadcast. I think that there needs to be another solution. Sanctions so far has not worked. Isolating them so far has not worked, particularly when we have seen that despite everything that we're doing from one side, they're being protected. And so they do still have allies, they do still have people that are supporting them. And so ultimately it just makes the situation more fractured. And I worry about the recovery. I worry about people's livelihoods. There are electricity cuts that are being happening right now. Food prices are going up. Work availability is going down. So even just in Damascus, which has been relatively up until the last few weeks unscathed by this, you're starting to see now it hitting much closer to home in the capital. And it's heartbreaking. There are people that are not going to be able to afford to buy food, to pay for their gas bill, to find work. And that's going to start a whole other set of social problems, unemployment, medical conditions, all these sorts of things that I feel like should also be on the table if we're going to discuss these types of things. It's very responsible to talk about sanctions economically, to not also address the psychological, the emotional, all the other impacts that are going to be taking place on a population that is trapped in the middle of this.
And when the people that you speak to back in Damascus, are they all of one voice on this? Do they all agree on what to do?
I think people, the family members that I've spoken to are resigned. It's a lose-lose situation. Either the regime stays in power and continues its record of suppressing opinions and dissent, or if the regime falls, it's going to be replaced by what exactly? More power-hungry factions. And most people don't know if it's going to be even better than Assad. I mean, people are taking a big risk in assuming that by arming the opposition, we're going to get something that is going to give us a better option. But ultimately, with the religious elements that have been taking place, I think a lot of people are worried that things are going to get much, much worse. Right. So I think they're just resigned.
Let's hope that doesn't pan out that way. I want to thank you very much for joining us, Raf Harfouch. I want to thank as well Émeric Elouin, as well Anton Kozlov and Bilal Saab for being with us from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's time for business right here on France 24.